Hello, everyone. Welcome to Utopia Science Fiction, the podcast. Today, I'm joined with our design editor, Jonathan. Hello, Jonathan. And we are going to discuss a short story or a segment of a story by Larry Niven entitled Warriors. Larry Niven was born in Los Angeles in 1938. He's one of the few people could place in the golden science fiction era, or slightly after that, who's still alive today. But he's one of the leading science fiction authors, recognized for his mercurial science and scientific imagination, as exercised in Tales of the Known Space, which is a series of books that take place in the same universe. His short fiction has been published in several collections and won multiple prizes and awards. Let's do a quick recap. Do you want to start us off, Jonathan?
So, basically, an alien ship has discovered a human ship, and they are trying to figure out what they can about its defenses before they kill the crew and take it for a prize. Basically with the intent of conquering and enslaving humanity.
When it starts off, you're not immediately aware that it is an alien species that your perspective is in. It starts off with the captain looking at this alien ship. It's not until the fourth or fifth line when it says the captain flicked his tail back and forth that you realize that it's not a human narrative. And the captain calls up the telepath. And so he uses the telepath to try to reach into the other ship. And then we discover that the other ship is human.
It's a good way to transition from the alien ship into the human ship and sort of change the perspective. Prior to that, prior to the telepath coming up, we actually get quite a bit of world building through speculation on what kind of technology the other ship has. The human ship needs to spin to generate gravity, centrifugal force. They refer to a device they have called the gravity planer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they seem to think the Earth ship is rather primitive and doesn't hold a threat, but they're not sure.
And that's why they call in the telepath, basically to read their minds and find out what weapons, if any, they have. And, well, much to the telepath's shock, even the idea of violence is just to the human crew.
These thoughts from the alien telepath's point of view as being wholly alien and horrible, terrifying, because they're peaceful. Because they're not really threatening.
And so he discovers that they don't have weapons because they're totally peaceful, so the captain decides to kill them slowly using heat. That way he can take the angel's pencil intact and figure out where they came from and basically lead the conquest of Earth and, of course, claim a generous percentage of the wealth for himself and even earn a name, which, that's a nice little detail that I love, establishing a little bit of the culture there. Kazinti are usually referred to by their occupations until they accomplish something worthy.
I like that when you have this transition from when the telepath reaches out, you all of a sudden switch viewpoints to the crew. So you learn a bit about the Earth crew, Steve, Weaver, and, they keep thinking they're excited to make contact with the Kazin, with this alien species. They think that they're peaceful and they want to learn from them. And so they're just wholly unaware of the threat.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's a fairly typical alien invasion story. Are they peaceful? Are they hostile? But there are also a lot of ways where it's totally not. Like, here the Kazin are totally warlike, whereas humanity has become totally peaceful. Almost utopian, although I would probably argue it's actually more of a false utopia, because it's enforced in part through revisionist history. Very, very few people actually qualify for actual study of Earth's history. They only know, generic, there were wars in the past, but that's all in the past. It doesn't matter now.
I wondered how much of that was just, like studying ancient Rome in detail. Not too many people do that, but it's not necessarily because it's prevented. It's a choice to try to remember all those things about Earth.
They know generically that there's definitely a sense of ignorance from most of the crew, that even things like the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They just know that it happened. Like there's a mention of, do you know what a concentration camp is?
I like that the name of the ship is the Angel's Pencil.
Yeah, and I love how it's tied into the initial description of the ship like a giant mechanical pencil. So one thing that I really like is that Steve Weaver isn't actually from Earth. He's a Belter, which actually gives him, despite his lack of academic knowledge about Earth's history, a lot of the techniques that humanity has for preventing outbreaks of violence aren't as common out in the belt, simply because it's harder to get the resources that they need. It gives him a different perspective, and so he is suspicious of the alien ship that they've encountered.
Mm.
And it kind of gives him an idea of, it allows him the chance to sort of on the fly figure out a way to defend the ship when they come under attack.
Yeah, so it starts heating up inside. The Kazin use these inductors to raise the temperature of the vessel. And so at first they're not sure what's going on.
Yeah,
and
like,
then
is it an attempt to communicate?
They're still attempting. Yeah.
But Steve is like, it doesn't matter. It's going to kill us. So he turns the ship around and activates the main engine, which is basically they describe it as a photon drive.
So it uses light to project itself forward, as I understand it.
Mm-hmm. And
like a focused light.
Yeah, and I think there is some theoretical science behind that. But anyway, he aims basically the engine at the Kazinti ship, and it basically turns it into a high-powered laser, which slices through the Kazinti ship and tears it apart.
And before this happens, you switch back to the Kazin point of view, and the captain's feeling rather smug because there are no weapons. But then he realizes that the telepath couldn't recognize weapons if the people he was scanning didn't know what weapons were.
Exactly. That's a very clever way of surviving.
Yeah.
Both in character and out of character from a story perspective. Yeah.
It's very interesting. Yeah, so the ship is destroyed when the ship tries to get away, and so Davis, one of the other crew, comes up to Steve, and he understands what's happened, that Steve used the drive as a kind of weapon to defend themselves. And Steve denies it at first. He says, no, I wouldn't do that. But Jim figures it out. He nails it.
Yeah, and he's a veteran.
Yeah.
He knows when shit's going down.
They agree to try to keep it secret, because the rest of the crew just don't understand violence. They won't understand purposefully using that drive to defend themselves. And it's up to Jim and Steve to now go and warn Earth and prepare Earth that there is a hostile alien out there. And they talk about reverse engineering some of Kazin technology to use in what they assume will be further conflicts that come up. And that's where the story ends.
Yep, and of course this is Larry Niven's first short story, or at least the first one he had published. And it's definitely a good starting point for what would be a long-running series of stories.
Known Space World gets started here. And there's Ring World, that series is encompassed in here. A bunch of short stories. The Man Kazin Wars series is also caught. And so a lot of his stories take place in this universe, and this is the first introduction to it.
Mm-hmm. The Man Kazin Wars were mostly written by other authors, partly because Larry Niven was not a soldier, and so he didn't feel comfortable writing stories about war.
So the first question we really need to ask, and this is the most important question we'll tackle, the Kazin, Star Trek or not? Because the Kazin appear and are mentioned in an animated series of Star Trek. And I think they were originally written for Star Trek, or were they originally written for this story and then made their way into Star Trek?
So they were originally written for this story. Later on, Larry Niven would write another story featuring the Kazinti set sometime after the 4-Man Kazin Wars, called The Soft Weapon. And he expressed an interest in writing for Star Trek, so he got tapped for the animated series and adapted his short story into the Slaver Weapon. So a lot of the characters from his original short story were changed to, of course, members of the regular cast. So Nessus, the puppeteer, became Spock. I'm not sure who the other characters were in the original short story, but Sulu took over for another, and of course, Uhura was the last one.
Are these the ones with? Are these like the Ringworld ones with Wu and?
Yeah, although I'm not sure if Louis Wu was part of that story or not, so that's why I'm hesitant to say that he became Sulu. I haven't actually read The Soft Weapon, so...
Yeah, I've only read the Ringworld series, and a few of his short stories, which are always excellent. Should the Kazin count as a Star Trek species?
I would say so. So the Kazin made their appearance in The Slaver Weapon. They were also name-dropped in the Star Trek Picard episode Nepenthe. Riker mentioned that they were causing problems. And in Lower Decks Season 2, we actually meet a Kazin member of the Cerritos crew. So they are now part of Star Trek canon.
Uh-huh. So I'd like to think that this story and all the other stories are just mirror universes, or parallel universes of the Star Trek universe. That's going to be my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I reject your reality and substitute my own.
Exactly. So what do you think the main theme or themes are of this short story?
It definitely feels like a bit of a satire of both the hawks and the doves. Each of them basically has their own utopia represented here. Like the Kazinti are very much the hawks. The ultra-conservative, totally patriarchal. They make mention that only one gender is sentient among them. And of course, a culture dedicated to war and violence. And of course, the humans represent the doves, who have rejected war and have become totally pacifist, or almost totally. And so basically sort of showing that both sides are wrong, basically by showing that pacifism can leave you vulnerable.
Yeah.
When you come up against someone who wants to kill you.
Yeah, I like there's that line where they're talking about violence being a sickness that they've learned to treat on Earth. And Steve goes, well, maybe they'll think I'm sick too, but it's the kind of sickness that we'll need. And it's kind of, I guess, even there has to be an understanding of violence. It's a part of human nature. It's a part of, even if you don't accept it or practice it, you can't erase it. You have to understand it in order to defend against it.
Yeah.
Okay, so is this story a utopia or not a utopia?
I would say it's the end of Utopia.
That's what it feels like. It starts off very utopic, but then it starts to talk about the collapse of that utopia when an unknown element is introduced. And I wonder if that's the best way to portray, like, I think Utopia can survive the introduction of these outside elements. So maybe it's not the death of Utopia, but it's a change. It's a transformation to another kind of utopia. But that seems to be another story. This particular story ends with with a threat being there, that utopia may very well end because violence is going to become necessary.
Exactly. So for people who know this society and actually like what they've accomplished, this is the end. This is basically the apocalypse. But for those who understands that, we have these impulses for a reason, they helped us to survive. It's only when they became a liability that we needed to get rid of them.
When they weren't controlled, if that's the right word, when they got out of hand.
I think that's a pretty accurate description because of the terminology that they use, violence is a sickness, and how totally unprepared they are for violence of any kind, that even the mention of it just makes them go, it's like suddenly meeting Cthulhu. Which consequently is kind of the telepath's reaction to reading their minds.
That's actually not a bad comparison.
So, how did you come across this story the first time?
I enjoyed it. I think it suffers from what almost all of the old science fiction suffers, and that's just a small amount of sexism, where the main characters that save the day are white males. But given its time period, I don't have any issue with that. I thought it was a good story, very short and very well done for being so short. How did you
Yeah,
come across
and
it?
from the get-go, I kind of recognized a little bit of the satire there. It was on rereading it a couple of months ago that I kind of caught on to some of the potential, exaggerations of the growing divide between the liberal and conservative perspective in the United States. Sort of predicting the future, unfortunately.
That's an interesting perspective, yeah.
And I don't think it's possible to really read this, especially looking deeper into Gazinti culture post Roe v. Wade being overturned.
Actually, that's a terrifying, terrifying comparison. It is very right wing, the Kazin kind of utopic ideas of
Yeah.
war and property and conquest.
And of course, profit.
And profit,
Because
yeah.
I have to admit, I do kind of like that idea of accomplishing something and then getting a name. But on the other hand, that kind of means that anyone who doesn't do something spectacular is nameless.
So I feel like if
And
I were to get
forgotten.
a name for accomplishing something, I would want my name to be I gave my cat a pill. That is a Herculean accomplishment. So gives pills to cats. There we go.
You put down the Kazinti. One of the worlds they mentioned in the discussion between the captain and the alien technologies officer, Altair 1, and they describe a cult that thought it could travel through time, and they couldn't figure out, they figured, okay, they must have committed suicide using disintegrators, but then what happened to the disintegrators? There is actually a short story that is a prequel to this one that explains that whole thing, and it is hilarious. I
It
actually need
sounds
to.
great. I like the so they mentioned what I love the naming of planets in from Earth culture in all of Larry Niffin's stories. They mention the name of the planet. We made it, which is just perfect.
So it's in Mangazin Wars 13, and it's called Misunderstanding by Hal Colbatch and Jessica Q. Fox.
Oh, so it's not written by Larry Niffen.
Nope, they basically took that little exchange and made an entire short story out.
That sounds
And like
amazing.
I said, I read it once, and it is absolutely hilarious. Some of the antics those aliens came up to. And yes, they even name-dropped Star Trek.
I'll have to read this now. This will be on my to-read list.
I will definitely send you a link then.
Yeah, I think that's about all the time we have. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And we will see you all for the next podcast. Have a great day. Bye. Thank you for listening to Utopia Science Fiction, the podcast. The story we discussed today is Warriors by Larry Niven. You can find it by clicking on the link down below. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please consider supporting our magazine and podcast by following the link to join our Patreon below. Your support helps make everything we do possible, and we thank you all. And now, let us end with our usual refrain, let us go boldly, onward, ever onward, onward, through the impossible.